After a full week of news bursting with big headlines and stories over changes to immigration law, suggestions over spying in the UK, and the developing situation in Iran, there are lots of unanswered questions. These are questions like what the immigration policies actually mean, what the significance of the spying story really is, and how the conflict in Iran is affecting the so-called special relationship between the UK and the USA. We will answer all those questions and more in this week's episode of the Roundup by News of the Week. Here, you'll get the facts and context from the week's news so you can make your own decisions. And of course, this will be paired with the same balanced and in-depth analysis I try to bring to the news every week. That means if you've struggled to follow the news this week through frustration or a packed schedule, the Roundup is the place to be. As always, you can access the text episode of the Roundup for more detail on all of the stories included here. But while I've got you, you might as well listen, like, and subscribe to this episode right here, wherever you're watching. The first big beast of this episode is the immigration changes that were either speculated on, introduced, or consulted on this week. And they've prompted huge questions over fairness, viability, safety, and over what they mean and say about the government's policy in general. The first concerned the settlement changes, or the changes to indefinite leave to remain. You might have heard of it as ILR. If you're not new to this show, you'll remember that we talked about this a few weeks ago. And this was over a policy where settlement would be pushed back to 20 years for legal migrants, up from, I think, 5. It's the same policy which would see that time fluctuating on a case-by-case basis, and that's based on things like language, ability, employment, and contribution, as well as others. Now, these settlement policies, which are controversial because they're going to apply retroactively to people already on the path to settlement in the UK, will come into effect in 2027. But they faced a rebellion in Parliament of 30 MPs. What we've got to remember, and to be fair, is that these rebellions now, with 30 MPs, are a lot less than some of the others we've seen. There being less rebels this time suggests there is more consensus, or at least more agreement within the party over these immigration changes. Regardless, at the moment, this policy seems to be going through, and it will go through without further controversy. I did say we had to talk about immigration changes, not just change. So what's next? The second big development in immigration talks about deportation and returns, with the Home Office consulting on a plan to allow officials to intervene to physically remove families who remain in the UK illegally if they do not leave voluntarily. Are basically consulting on a scheme to assist deportations. It has two elements. One is that failed asylum seekers will be offered money to return voluntarily, up to £40,000 for a family of 4. If they do not take this option, the plan would then allow for physical intervention, and that was the focus of the Telegraph's headlines, which were talking about handcuffing kids. Now, despite this being a policy in other countries, the proposal shares some issues that we mentioned earlier. Over the safety, for example, there have been concerns with plans to physically deport people and families, and over how harsh and safe that could be, particularly for children. Second is the issue of fairness, with critics saying it's unfair for the government to be spending money to pay for migrants to leave while many British families are struggling financially. And this bit relates to the other part of the policy where migrant families could be given £40,000 to leave the UK voluntarily. Now, that argument probably won't kill the policy because these things always involve trade-offs, and there are also arguments to counter it, and that leads us to the third issue of viability. This consultation will involve a pilot scheme, which is what we've been talking about so far. It will be focused on initially 150 families, and despite that cost, the Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood has said this could actually save money. Her reasoning is that this costs around £158,000 to house a family of 4 in an asylum hotel every year, and she said that these circumstances usually stretch for several years. So removing them, even at a cost of £40,000, would actually be saving the taxpayer money. And that sort of deals with the issue of fairness. But it creates a whole new issue, because in the long term, as the government are planning to phase out the use of asylum hotels, the savings that this could create are minimised, because other forms of housing asylum seekers reportedly cost 6 times less than using hotels. So when we use less hotels and more asylum seekers are being housed in other modes of housing, the savings will be reduced. So while the pilot scheme may save money in the short term, its long-term financial impact remains contested, even if the fairness argument is somewhat muddled and the safety argument remains outstanding as well. The third piece of immigration policy this week concerns student visas, with the government suspending visas for students from Afghanistan, Cameroon, Sudan, and Myanmar. Officials say applications from these countries have increased sixfold since 2021, and that tells you a little bit about the reasoning behind the changes. But also, the specific concern is that some applicants may be using the student visa route as a pathway into the UK and then overstaying on their visa, which is its own form of illegal migration. The policy is obviously part of the government's broader strategy we've seen that's emerged over the last year to tackle illegal migration. To my knowledge, this is the first bit that concerns these sorts of, or this route of illegal migration, talking about student visas, and it's different to the other schemes with expanded deportation schemes, increased border funding, the return incentives we're talking about, closing of legal loopholes. At the moment, this policy only affects those 4 countries, but the government also said it could be expanded. And that's why it says so much about the rest of the government strategy. It's another part of this multifaceted approach to tackling illegal migration. I've said before that that requires all of these different aspects to work, and if they all did work, you would start to see a more effective policy. But that's why we're seeing the short-term pain, because what the policies aren't working at scale at the moment. So there's questions, so the same questions that have applied so far will also apply to this policy. And also, there's another issue, because this is clearly aimed at reducing migration numbers. All 3 of these policies are, and appealing to voters concerned about immigration. Now, in electoral terms, that means they're likely focusing on the right and the challenge from the right. But recently, they've undergone significant challenge from the left of the party and outside of it too, with Zach Polanski's Green Party winning a by-election literally a week and a half ago. So as much as it shows the government are adding another step in their immigration policy, that there's different concerns in other areas, there's also an immediate concern for the government strategy as well, which is important to remember here. Moving on, though, there's another major story this week which concerned the government's social cohesion strategy, which is reigniting concerns over the practicality of a definition for Islamophobia. The Independent reported on a leaked 47-page draft proposal which outlined measures expected to be announced soon. The plans reportedly include appointing a special representative tasked with tackling hostility and hatred directed at Muslims. Now, there would be, alongside this, there would be an £800 million fund distributed over 10 years to around 40 areas where social cohesion is considered under threat. And one of the most controversial elements of this policy is a formal definition of Islamophobia being adopted by public bodies. It's not clear yet how the legal status of the definition would actually work. It isn't something that I've been able to find out while I've been researching this, but the contest here comes over practically within the public bodies, and i.e. that a definition over Islamophobia could affect what people can and can't say when debating religion. And in terms of supporting their own religion versus others, there's going to be different classifications of religion if there's a Islamophobia religion and not like a Christian phobia religion, you know? And that's all while supporters of the policy say it's necessary for safety. And so the effectiveness of the policy would be dependent on 3 things. One is the powers of this special representative. The second is how the £800 million funding will actually be distributed, and the third is over whether the definition of Islamophobia carries real weight and how that interacts with other definitions and the freedoms that people enjoy. It's also worth noting that these are just draft proposals so far, so the government hasn't confirmed them yet, and they could be changed again, which would also affect the outcomes. Staying on the issue of religion in British politics, though, there's been a development around anti-Semitism in schools, but what does that actually mean? Well, the Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson has launched an independent review into anti-Semitism in schools and colleges. That follows reports that anti-Semitic incidents have doubled since 2023. The government has announced £7 million in funding to help tackle the issue and says that upcoming curriculum reforms may also address it. However, an independent review takes time. These recommendations aren't legally binding, but they obviously carry influence as something the government has started. One challenge to that influence, though, is that these reviews can take years to conclude, which sometimes means their findings arrive after the political context has already changed, and that muddies down their impact. So basically, this is being reviewed or looked into by the government, and that could create policy in the future, but it's not a given that it will. Moving on to foreign policy. The biggest international story of the week has been that the escalating conflict with Iran, Israel, and the United States. This has prompted questions over the UK's role, the impact of the war could have, and what it practically means for the special relationship with the USA. Last weekend, the US and Israel carried out bombing operations in Iran. The UK was not initially involved, and Prime Minister Keir Starmer suggested this was partly due to concerns about the legality of the conflict. He said that his government had learned the lessons that they should have done from Iraq. Now, that position disappointed some, no one more than the US president. Criticism from criticism from Trump questioned the UK's reliability as an ally of the USA. However, the situation has changed since then as well, because Iran started launching retaliatory strikes against neighbouring countries. At that point, the UK adjusted its position, and it allowed US forces to use British bases for defensive operations. The UK has also considered deploying its own forces for those defensive purposes as well. Now, that led to further criticism from the US President, Donald Trump, who argued American forces did not need assistance from allies who joined conflicts after they'd already been won. He also called the UK not so great. There have been other interventions too, which have added to the commentary, with former PM Tony Blair reportedly arguing privately initially that the UK should have backed the US from the beginning, given the importance of their alliance. And there's also been polling suggesting that Starmer's original cautious approach was actually popular with the British public. But what about all those questions I said that this prompted? Well, in terms of the practical bits about the war, there isn't a lot to talk about. There's no suggestion this will end soon, and it's one of the most uncertain aspects about the conflict. Then there's all the economic uncertainty, and that creates more confusion, and it's not even over yet. But in terms of the UK's role, as with a lot of the foreign policy we've seen from the Labour government, it's been quite pragmatic, quite committed to international law, and this is no different. It's been behind that decision for defensive strikes only, and that will likely then be one of the biggest drivers behind decisions going forward, and that's how I'm viewing it, if you like. On the special relationship, though, between the UK and the USA, media coverage has focused on tensions between leaders and the practical aspect of the UK not being with the USA on this. But the reality is much more complicated. The UK-US relationship has already survived wars, economic crises, disagreements between leaders, and declining military capability. That's because it isn't just political, and that political aspect has historically ebbed and flowed. The political relationship that can reinforce the special relationship is underlined and supported by cooperation on intelligence, security, as well as a shared history and close national ties with a shared national interest. So, while there may be short-term tensions and there may be a lack of and strained personal relationship between Starmer and the USA, between Starmer and Trump, it's unlikely that this undoes the whole special relationship, because there is still so much cooperation and so much strategic benefits from the two sides being aligned. Moving on from discussion of the Iran crisis, though, another foreign policy story involved the Chagos Islands, and the Mauritian Prime Minister Navin Ramgoolam has suggested that his government may consider legal action over the future of the islands. Mauritius reportedly faces a £160 million gap in its finances, and there are disputes over the compensation linked to the deal. However, UK officials have said there is no legal basis for compensation if the agreement isn't ratified, and to my knowledge, that's the case. There isn't any precedent for this to go further. Now, if that assessment holds, and that's true, then the most likely outcome will simply be that the deal collapses unless negotiations restart. And that's this week's weekly update on the developing Chagos deal, which seems to be in every single episode at the moment. Moving on to general politics, though, One of the most unusual stories this week concerned spying allegations linked to China. The husband of Labour MP Joanne Reid, who represents East Kilbride and Strathaven, was arrested alongside two other men on suspicion of spying for China. And police have searched homes and vehicles linked to the investigation, but they say there is no immediate threat to public safety. Reid has said she never knowingly met Chinese diplomats or business figures and described herself as a social democrat who is not an apologist for what she called the Chinese dictatorship. Later in the week, she suspended herself from the party while the investigation internally continued. But politically, the story could revive concerns about Chinese influence and espionage in the UK. That may lead to increased scrutiny around the recently approved Chinese mega embassy. And unfortunately for Reid, even if she herself has done nothing wrong, political damage through association is always a risk in these cases. So while it's too early to tell for sure, this could have negative implications for her role as an MP. Finally, moving on to stats and trends though, let's look at polling because there's been developments there too. A recent YouGov voting intention poll showed the Greens have risen to 21% in the polls, and that places them second behind Reform UK, who are on 23%. The main parties, traditionally Labour and the Conservatives, were tied on 16%, which is one of Labour's lowest in recent years. And the Liberal Democrats are on 14% and behind everyone else. According to YouGov, this is, like I said, one of Labour's lowest results and simultaneously the highest ever figure recorded for the Greens. However, let's put this into context because that matters. These weekly trackers are not predictions of election results. The next general election is still years away, but what they are useful for is tracking short-term shifts in public opinion and to judge how different events in British politics influence public opinion. And in this case, the likely driver appears to be the Greens' recent by-election win in Gorton and Denton, which has temporarily boosted the party's visibility and support. Overall, this week has shown three major themes in British politics. First, the government is pushing ahead with tighter immigration policies, despite potential criticism from the left of the party. Second, there have been concerns over spying, and we do not yet know the full impact of that. Third, there is the other ongoing situation in Iran, which is creating global instability, concerns over the special relationship, which are possibly inflated, and curiosity about the UK's involvement. How these issues develop will likely become clearer over the coming weeks, and I will continue to cover them here on the Roundup. That means you should like and subscribe so you can stay up to date with British political news with News of the Week. And while we're on the subject of you doing something, feel free to leave a comment with your thoughts on this episode. And if you liked it, check out newsoftheweek.net where you can access the full written episode and all of my sources. Thank you very much for listening. I'll be back next week. Bye.